At the edge of the world, at land's end, there is a headland extending into the sea. At the end of that headland stands a tower. The 9th tower. Within the tower lies mystery and meaning. Truth and troth. Revelations and realizations. All you need to do is open the door. Welcome back to Tales from the 9th Tower. I'm Lothar Tuppen. Once upon a time, there was a man. He had grown very successful. He had money. He owned good land, which provided for healthy livestock. He had a wife whom he loved. But whenever he went to town, and especially when stopping at a tavern, his neighbors, his colleagues, his friends, they all wondered why he had no children.
Who will carry on your name? Who will work your fields and tend your animals? Who will speak for you when you die?
He had no answers, even for himself. His childless state became a joke, which for him quickly turned mocking. So much so that he could not drink with his neighbors without anger burning in his chest. One night, consumed with rage, he stormed home. His wife looked at him with concern. "What's wrong, my love?"
"I will have a child, even if it is a hedgehog."
9 months later, his wife gave birth to a son who was a strong boy from the waist down, and a hedgehog from the waist up. She looked at the child with her joy turning to terror, and turned to her husband. "Do you see what you have done to us?"
"There's nothing to be done. He must be christened. But a boy as disgusting as he is, you are the cause of this. All I am saying is that we won't be able to find a godfather for him."
"I'm naming him Hans. Hans the Hedgehog." Now when the parson came to christen Hans, his mother had blood on her hands and breast. I can't feed him properly. His quills hurt too much." The parson looked from the woman to the child.
"I don't think he would do well in an ordinary bed either."
"No, his quills tangle him in the bed sheets and pierce the mattress."
"Lay down some straw behind the stove where it is warm. Let that be his bed."
The parson left, and inevitably, now the entire region knew of Hans the Hedgehog. 8 years passed, and increasingly the man could not stand the sight of his son.
"I can't do this. I can't be a father to him. I wish he would just die."
Hans didn't die, though. He grew, and he slept, and he lived behind the stove on his bed of straw. And one day, a fair was coming to town. The man planned to go and asked his wife what he should buy. "Bring back some of that rare food. Maybe some sausages and breads, something special for us all to eat." Then he asked his wife's maid what she wanted. "Oh, sir, I would dearly love some slippers, and my friend said that a merchant there sells these beautiful stockings with clocks on them. Well, that would be lovely." He then asked Hans what he would like. "Father, I would very much like to have some bagpipes if you would." The man just shrugged and went off. And when he returned from the fair, he gave his gifts to his wife and her maid before going behind the stove and handing Hans the bagpipes. Hans nodded, and then firmly looked at his father. "Father, go to the forge and get the rooster shod. If you do this, I will ride away, probably never to return, if this would please you."
"Aye, it would. I'll do it right away."
And the man shod the rooster with a joy he hadn't felt in ages. When the job was done, Hans the Hedgehog carefully kissed his mother goodbye, mounted the rooster, and herded some asses and pigs. He then set off with his little herd and went into the dark forest. Now, if it's a wonder why the man allowed Hans to leave with some of his livestock, well, he didn't know about it, as he wasn't there to see his son off. Hans went through the forest until he found a suitable tall tree. He spurred the cock, which flew to the highest branches, and there he sat. For many years he sat on his rooster and watched over his asses and pigs while playing his bagpipes. Now he played beautifully, and his music rang through the forest, and his herd grew over the years. One day, a king came traveling through the forest. He'd gotten lost, and although he had some servants with him, he was beginning to despair, and he really hated being lost. It had always terrified him. But wait, the king faintly heard beautiful music coming from somewhere nearby. The king sent his servant to find where the sound came from, but followed closely behind because he didn't want to be left alone in the confusing woods. They quickly found the tree the sound was coming from and saw that the beautiful music was made by a strange animal high up in the branches. The king thought it was a strange chimera of some type, some cockatrice-like monster with the body of a cock but with two heads. One that of a rooster, and another one of a hedgehog growing out of its back. And it was the hedgehog head that was blowing the bagpipes.
Faithful Johann, ask that strange creature what it is and what it is doing here.
Excuse me, my liege, the king, wishes to know what you are and what you are doing here.
And ask him if he knows the way back to my kingdom.
And if you could, show us the way back to my lord's kingdom.
Hans the Hedgehog descended and dismounted his cock, who started pecking the ground eagerly, and looked at the two men. In answer to your first question, I'm Hans the Hedgehog, and I'm tending my herd and playing my music. In answer to your second question, from my high perch I have learned all the ways of this forest, which most people fearfully get lost in. I would gladly show you the way back, in exchange for a gift from you.
Ask him what his price is.
What is your price, Master Hedgehog?
If the king would write a bond, signed legally, that he promises to give me whatever it is that first greets him when he arrives at the royal courtyard, when he reaches home, then I will lead you out of this forest. The king and his servant wandered away a bit while Hans scratched behind the ear of one of his asses.
My lord, I highly recommend that you do not agree to this creature's strange demands. He is foul. Indeed, he rides afoul, and it is well known that someone with so many sharp quills cannot be trusted. I say, give him a counter-offer of a bag of gold or more asses, something like that.
Nay, Johann, I will not give up gold, or anything else for that matter. This horrid creature knows nothing. I will use high language to make it seem like I am acquiescing to his demands, when I am actually reaffirming the complete opposite.
Very clever, sire. Again, you instruct and amaze your humble servant.
Indeed.
So the king drafted his false bond, and Hans the Hedgehog, who had mounted his cock, led the king and his servant out of the forest. And then they were able to safely find their way home. Hans the Hedgehog returned to his tree and his herd again, and beautiful music again filled the forest. As the king approached his home, his daughter saw him on the road and ran out to meet him. He jumped off his horse and hugged her gladly, laughing in joy, and then his mood soured as he remembered Hans the Hedgehog. He told her the whole story, ending with how instead of writing that Hans should get what he desired, he cleverly wrote that Hans should indeed never get what he desired.
Thank you, father, for I never would have gone with such an evil creature.
I'm not sure that he was evil. Horrid, maybe.
No, father. Anything at all like you describe must be evil. Even the music you describe must truly be evil, no matter how pretty it seemed to sound.
The king was very glad that he drafted his bond the way that he did. Now, Hans continued his life in the forest. His herd grew, and his music continued to sound. And another day came, when another king from a different kingdom found himself lost in the forest. And with him were attendants and runners, and none of them knew the way out of this maze-like forest. The king heard bagpipes in the distance, playing beautiful music, and wondered where it could be coming from. Faithful Franz.
Yes, Your Majesty.
Let us find where that music is coming from. Soon the king and his company found their way to the foot of the tree where Hans was perched.
Good sir.
Hans stopped playing and looked down at the king and his company.
I say, could I speak with you a moment?
Hans flew down to the ground and dismounted his cock, which again started pecking the ground eagerly.
How incredible. A cock as a steed. And what a wondrous creature you are. What do you do here?
I'm Hans the Hedgehog, and I keep my asses and my pigs, and I play my music. But in honor of hospitality, I should ask you what your desire is here in my forest.
The king here is in need of aid. We have gotten him lost, and we've gotten ourselves lost. I'm no better than the others at being able to figure out where we are. We are lost, and we would appreciate any help you could give that would remedy our plight and guide us home.
Hans nodded and said, Your Majesty, if you would write a bond, signed legally, that promises to give me whatever it is that first greets you when you arrive at the royal courtyard of your home, then I'll lead you out of this forest.
This seems strange to me, but if that is your price, then agreed. Franz, bring me my quill. Yes, Your Majesty.
The king wrote out his promise, specifying exactly the terms that Hans the Hedgehog requested, signed it, and showed it to Hans. Hans nodded again, mounted his cock, and led the king and his retinue out of the forest and back towards their kingdom. Hans returned to his herd, flew back up the tree, and again took up the bagpipes. The king had an only daughter who was extremely beautiful and wise and kind, and when she saw her father riding down the road toward home, she ran out to meet him, delighted to see him again, as by this time he was very late. She asked him what had detained him, and he told her the entire story of Hans the Hedgehog. He told her of the bargain that he had signed, and he began to look sick at what he had promised. "Father, he brought you back to me. While I can't say that I would wish to be taken by a strange cock-riding hedgehog, I would not dishonor our line by breaking your oath. If he comes for me, I will go with him." Now Hans had truly taken care of his herd, and the pigs especially had multiplied, so much so that they filled the entire forest. So Hans descended the tree and said, "It's time to leave the forest. This is my home no longer." At a nearby village, he arranged for a rider to send a message to his mother stating that he was returning, and with a great herd of pigs, enough that everybody could eat their fill of pork and be rich in swine for some time. All the families of the region were to be invited to the homecoming. Now when the man heard of the returning of his son, he was troubled. He thought Hans must have died years ago. How had a useless half-hedgehog of a son been able to survive with a rooster steed and a bunch of asses and swine? But Hans was returning, believe it or not. Hans, mounted on his cock, drove the pigs before him as he rode triumphantly home. Those who mocked or feared him before now laughed in joy, because he brought the riches of livestock and meat back to the community. Smiling a hedgehog smile, Hans said, "Let us have a feast!" And what a feast it was. Everyone had a great time, and praised the strange Hans the Hedgehog for his generosity, except for one man, who stayed quiet throughout the great feast, and if truth be told, was a bit afraid of his son. After everyone had gone back to their homes, Hans the Hedgehog said to the man, "Father, shod the cock once more for me at the forge, and again I will ride away. You will never see Hans the Hedgehog again."
"Gladly,"
was the only response. Upon leaving his parents, Hans the Hedgehog journeyed to the kingdom of the first king, the one who had first gotten lost in the forest, and upon approaching the royal palace, he was greeted with armed guards and pikes. Is this how you treat all guests?
"We were told, if anyone came with bagpipes mounted on a cock, that we should stop him and kill him. We were expecting some sort of crazy Scotsman, but you're even uglier than a Scot. Get him!"
But Hans just spurred his rooster, who flew over the guards, over the gate, and onto the sill of the window to the king's chambers. The rooster pecked fiercely at the window while Hans roared at the king within. "Oathbreaker! Liar! False king! You will give me what is my due, or you and your daughter will die. You have 3 hours!" The king, terrified of the monster at his window, raced to his daughter and pulled her towards her chamber.
"Father, what is the meaning of this?"
"You're getting married."
"What?"
"To a hedgehog.
"What?"
If you don't do it, he will kill us both. Do as I say, girl."
The king had her dressed in her finest white gown and had a carriage with 6 white horses prepared. He also filled the carriage with an offering of gold and jewels. And in 2 hours and 55 minutes after being accosted by the strange chimerical rooster hedgehog monster, the king presented Hans the Hedgehog, his daughter. Sick with revulsion and disbelief, the daughter climbed into the carriage with Hans, and in case you're wondering, his rooster rode next to the bewildered and terrified driver of the carriage. And as they drove away, the king thought he would never see his daughter again.
"I can't do this! You are revolting, evil! Oh, someone deliver me from this hideous creature!"
Hans just looked at her, grabbed her, took all of her fine false clothing off, and pierced her skin with quills till she was bloody. "That is for the falseness of you and your father. I wouldn't have you for anything in the world. On your way." And with that, he ordered the driver to stop the carriage, kicked her out on the road, bloodied and naked, and sent her back home in shame. Word got around, and she was disgraced for the rest of her life. Hans then journeyed to the kingdom of the second king, who had been lost in his forest. Outside of the city, Hans left the carriage, mounted again his cock, and rode with his bagpipes towards the royal palace. Here he was met by guards who presented arms to him and cried out, "Long life to Hans the Hedgehog!" They then gave him honored escort to the royal palace. The king met him at the threshold while his daughter looked down from above.
"It is good to see you again, friend Hans, although I do have a favor to ask of you."
"What is it, your majesty?"
"Be patient with my daughter. She is honoring her father and her father's agreement with you, but this was not her choice, and you have to admit, your appearance is a bit uncanny."
Hans the Hedgehog nodded. The king brought Hans into a great feasting hall, and was soon joined by the king's daughter, who looked terrified but walked courageously towards her strange bridegroom. They ate and they drank, and shortly, to not prolong the deed, were married. A bridal chamber was prepared, and when it came time for them to sleep, the princess looked at her husband with tears in her eyes. "My lord, I'm afraid of your quills. Please, don't hurt me." "Do not fear, my lady. I would not and will not harm you in any way. Go and fetch your father. We have something to discuss." When she and her father returned, Hans had a request of him. "Your Majesty, if you would, station 4 men at the door of our chamber, and build a great fire burning in our fireplace. Before I get into bed this evening, I will creep out of my hedgehog skin and leave it lying on the floor here. If the men are fast and deft enough, they will be able to throw it into the fire, and if they guard it until it is finally and completely consumed, I won't have to wear it ever again."
"Yes, I will make it so, son-in-law."
When the clock struck 11, Hans the Hedgehog went into the room, stripped off his hedgehog skin, and left it lying where he said he would. Now the men ran into the room, grabbed the skin, threw it in the fire where it was consumed in a weird flame, which smelled of old things, eldritch things. When it was finally burnt, the princess lit the candles and looked toward her husband. Hans lay there, fully human but blackened as if he had been, burnt in a great fire. The guards called for the king, who sent for his physician. The physician washed him with his most precious ointments and anointed him with a healing balm. Soon, the charred blackness came off, revealing the healthy, fresh skin of a handsome young man. "My husband, you are beautiful." Hans nodded, tears in his eyes, and fell asleep next to the princess. The next morning, the palace arose with great joy, and they all broke their fast properly with a fine meal. Then the wedding was performed again, now that Hans was in human form. The king, seeing that his kingdom would be in good hands, bequeathed everything to Hans and the princess. Years later, King Hans and his queen went back to where he was born to see his parents. After joyfully reuniting with his mother, Hans went to see his father and said he was his son. The man explained that he had no son, and that he had one once, but that the boy was born as a hedgehog with quills. Hans then explained the truth to his father, who cried and nodded. The father and mother then went with the king and queen, and lived with them in their kingdom for the rest of their days. Now this tale is done, and away it runs to August's little house. For those who aren't familiar with this tale, it is tale number 108 from the Fairy Tales of the Brothers Grimm. I'm currently working on a much larger project involving many of the Grimm's tales, and although Hans the Hedgehog doesn't fit anywhere in that project, as I was analyzing all the tales, Hans let me know that his story needed to be told somewhere. The story just wouldn't let me go. For many people, the Grimm's tales are nonsensical, confusing, and with a common complaint that they are filled with flat characters. This truly has more to do with the rules that fairy tales operate under, which are very different than the rules of modern literary tales. In fairy tales, especially the oral ones that are more accurately called Märchen, which is a German term which roughly translates into wonder tale, different from the literary fairy tales that were written. In these tales, character growth is present, but it's usually hidden in the events and symbols of the story, not within the characters themselves. All of the internal is in the external. But one of the reasons I like this tale is that the estrangement between Hans and his father is universally recognizable to any audience. It's a good tale to revitalize as an example that those stories can still perform a service to a modern audience. That's one of the reasons I told it with as much straightforward narration as possible. I wanted the tale to speak for itself without too much smoke and mirrors or framing devices or dialogue. Although I don't think I can tell a story without using characters or voices, it's just not in my nature as a storyteller. Many of us, either as children or parents, or both, have experienced understanding and complete misunderstanding of our family. Sometimes family can seem like extensions of our own hearts, but too often they can seem unrecognizable and unable to be understood. For some people, words come hard. For others, it's easier, too easy sometimes. And no matter how pretty the words, doubts of their truth still abide. When someone says, "I understand," in regard to the struggles within the life of one they love, sometimes it can evoke resentments, either born of perceived dismissal, or, ironically, of what seems to be a false understanding. Even when said truly, what is maybe more accurately meant is, I understand enough to care. I understand enough to see your struggle. I understand enough to stand by your side in whatever small way, while you do what you have to do, necessarily alone in your unique battles. May we all care. May we all care enough to try and understand. Hail the stories, hail the listeners, and hail those who strive to recognize what lies in the hearts of the hedgehogs in their lives. Tales from the Ninth Tower, Number 5, Hans the Hedgehog. Story arrangement and performance by Lothar Tuppen. Sound effects from the Freesound Project. Music by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech. Sound design and mastering by Lothar Tuppen. This presentation is copyright 2023 to Lothar Tuppen, and this recording is released under a Creative Commons 3.0 Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. All other rights are reserved. The Ninth Tower Productions.